think the impulse is, well, you can point out to your blue in the face to a Christian nationalist that it's never worked before. But it's like arguing with a communist. It's like, well, true communism has never been tried. Like, yes, all these different communist countries have failed, but it's just because they haven't done the right version of communism yet. So, yes, all the Christian nationalist examples we have through history, they've all had really big, glaring flaws and failures. But it's because we haven't just gotten the formula right just yet, or put the right people in charge.
That was Paul Matzko, Senior Program Manager for AI and Emerging Technology at the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. He is also the host of the Unintended Consequences podcast. Last week, I presented the first part of my second interview with Paul on Christian nationalism. I interviewed Paul for the first season of Telling Jefferson Lies and wanted to expand our conversation. Last week, we discussed some of the history and contours of Christian nationalism as an ideology. This week, we discuss Paul's answer to my question, has Christian nationalism ever worked? Welcome to the podcast series, Telling Jefferson Lies. I'm Warren Throckmorton. This season, I'm focusing on two main aspects of the false belief that America was founded as a Christian nation. First, I'm exposing the false history which props up Christian nation storytelling. Second, I am listening to experts discuss the weaknesses of Christian nationalism. This interview is part of that second purpose. This week's episode is the conclusion of my interview with Paul Matzko on the consequences of Christian nationalism. Before we hear from the most recent interview, I want to replay some of what Paul had to say in the episode titled Wolf in Wolf's Clothing, during the first season of Telling Jefferson Lies. Paul was talking about Stephen Wolf's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism.
The first thing to note with Wolf, and in the book, he's very open. He lays this right out. He asserts that he does not take a historical approach to his topic of Christian nationalism, which is kind of shocking. I mean, Christian nationalism is not a new idea. There have been Christian nationalisms, and there are Christian nationalisms even before Wolf. And they're competing dual Christian nationalisms at any given point in time. You know, it's not just Republicans or the right who will cite the city on the hill. You know, America is supposed to be a shining city on the hill. You get both Republican and Democratic presidents who will cite Winthrop. It's not just the North who claim to be fighting for a godly nation against a Southern secession. It's Southern secession who adopt the language of religion and liturgy and ritual. There's a reason why Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, his monument is a shrine, right? You have religion permeated, Christian nationalism's permeated both North and South during the Civil War. So religious nationalism is old. And we could study that. You can be like, okay, look, this version of Christian nationalism, it accomplished these ends, it failed in these ways. In theory, you could use that to either negatively deconstruct someone's vision of Christian nationalism, which is what I would do, because I think all the historical examples I know about all ended in tears for people who are advocates of true religion and freedom of religion. Or you could use it to construct a better Christian nationalism. You could say, look, this worked well in this way. I'm going to take this piece from the Puritans in Massachusetts. I'm going to take this piece from the Catholic vision of Christendom in 17th century France. I'm going to take this piece. You could use it to construct or deconstruct, but Wolf says, no, I'm not going to do any of that. Instead, he takes an ahistorical approach to his topic. And he has one line here where he says, my method of approach is different from most. Instead of unfolding the nation as a concept or analyzing it with historical examples, I use a phenomenological method to uncover and reveal the nation as we exist and dwell in it, which is just a $5 word for a very basic concept. Phenomenological just means my method is whatever seems right in my personal experience. Like, this seems obvious to me. I'm going to give that like a scientific sounding label of phenomenology. And so he rejects history as a discipline and adopts his intuition is really what's going on. And he does that throughout the book. And so I think that shows up with his treatment of Jefferson. He doesn't really care about Jefferson or try to truly situate him in his historical context. He's looking to the life and career of Jefferson and James Madison and others at the time as a way to kind of like mine data points that support his broader project. In this regard, he's kind of like Barton. Barton will often do the same thing. He sees these characters, historical characters, as folks he can just like mine, drop in, find a quote that sounds like it's supportive of his mission, and ignore all the stuff that they say or do that doesn't fit that vision. So it's not a historical approach. It is a presentist approach.
The common sense idea that one might learn from past mistakes and fine-tune one's ideas seems lost on Christian nationalists in the present day. I don't trust present-day advocates of a Christian government to work things out any better than any past Christian dictator or autocrat. So I started out by asking, Paul, has Christian nationalism ever worked? Christian nationalism ever worked? You touched on this in the first season and talked about Christian nationalists today. They could look at other societies and say, well, this didn't work, let's fix this. That didn't work, let's fix this. But no, that's not what they do. They just insist on repeating all the mistakes. Mm-hmm. So I got me thinking, well, has it ever worked or come close? Or, why do these people now think that we should trust them to make it work if it's never worked before?
Well, I think the impulse is, well, you can point out to your blue in the face to a Christian nationalist that it's never worked before, but it's like arguing with a communist. It's like, well, true communism has never been tried. Like, yes, all these different communist countries have failed, but it's just because they haven't done the right version of communism yet. So, yes, all the Christian nationalist examples we have through history, they've all had really big glaring flaws and failures, but it's because we haven't just gotten the formula right just yet, or put the right people in charge, or so on. So no, I mean, again, talking here about formal high Christian nationalism. Yes, of course. No, I don't. I mean, this is also going to be informed. I am someone who's think of myself as a classical liberal. So other people might call me a libertarian. So I tend to think that the state is a very blunt instrument at best, and just generally a bad tool for compelling good belief, proper belief, and good behavior from individuals. And this gets back to, I know you're interested in Roger Williams and the difference between him and John Winthrop, but this gets back to something I think Roger Williams helps us with, which is he's the guy who coined the phrase liberty of conscience. The idea that for something to be truly, truly good, truly righteous, it has to be not a matter of just outward expression of conformity to behavior. It has to come from the heart. The conscience can't be compelled. The state is by its nature a tool of coercion. That's what it has. And that can be useful. That can do certain things. The state can help us discourage murder and theft. It can defend property rights. It can defend civil rights. Those are all good things, but it doesn't get at the heart of any of the people involved. The state can't help us with that. It's very bad at that. And its action can be contradictory. It can actually make those things worse. It can propel backlash. It can coarsen the heart. It can dehumanize our view of other people. I mean, this is core to Roger Williams. Liberty of conscience is not just the phrase he coined. It's the title of a really good biography of him by Edwin Gosted.
Yeah, I have that. Yeah.
You have that. There's also John Barry's The Creation of the American Soul.
Have that.
Is newer, also very good. So those are two great recommendations for anybody who hasn't. You have them. So that's great. But this might feel a little, I don't know how into the weeds to go here, but it's a big chunk of Roger Williams' political theology, his view of the relationship of the Christian to the state, is rooted in a debate over the first versus second table of the Ten Commandments. So if you'll bear with me, this gets a little arcane, a little in the weeds, but it's been very important for 2 millennia of Christian arguing over political theology. And so I think today a lot of people think of, well, the 10 Commandments, they think of it as a unitary thing. There are 10 of them. We call them the 10 Commandments. But if you remember depictions from film and TV, you've probably seen that the 10 Commandments are on 2 tablets. And usually those 2 tablets are written They're split between the two. It looks visually more pleasing if you have 5 on one and 5 on the other. But this was not just an aesthetic choice. It's actually deeper than that. So Christians, going all the way back to St. Augustine, have argued about which belong on the first tablet and which belong on the second tablet. And why that matters is because there appears to be, if you just read them as a work of literature, if you read them, you'll notice that there's 2 groupings of these 10 commandments. There's one group, a first group, which is primarily about the relationship between the individual and God. And there's a second group that's about the relationship between you and your neighbors. And the one about you and your God, well, again, if you believe in religion and faith as an internal, personal relationship between you and God, as a matter of conscience, it's internally generated. And if you think of the relationship between people, that's external. That's interaction. So we live in a society, man. That's that kind of relationship. And so if you think of those 2 differences, that has implications for what the state, what the nation, what the governing bodies should and shouldn't do and can't accomplish using law and justice and for the formal mechanisms of state power. And now there is debate about going all the way back to the early church fathers over which commandments belong on the first table and which were on the second. Because we don't have the original tablets, right, from Moses. They don't exist anymore, right? So we don't know for sure. But there would be this debate between theologians. Some would divvy them up. Augustine had 4 and 6. The first 4 were on the first tablet. The 6 were on the next. Lutherans and Catholics tended to say 3 and 7. The hinge there. So the first 3 are things like have no other idols, no other gods before me, things like that. The second tablet, everyone agrees, is things like thou shalt not murder, steal, lie. Everyone agrees that's so. There's some that everyone agrees on throughout the kind of Christian tradition. The hinge one tends to be number 4, which is remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. And so there's been long running debates between Sabbatarians versus non-Sabbatarians. Go all the way back. Should we, in other words, is Sabbath just the thing that I, as an individual Christian in my relationship with God, have to respect? Or is it a matter of social obligation with others? Therefore, the government should force everyone to recognize the Sabbath. And we have an echo of that even today. This is not just an ancient thing. There's a reason why in many states you cannot go and buy liquor at the ABC store on Sundays. That goes back to Christian prohibition advocates in the late 19th and early 20th century who wanted to use blue laws organized on Sabbatarian principles to prevent you from, because they wanted everyone to have to respect the Sabbath by not consuming liquor, because they saw that as contrary to the faith. So we still have echoes of it even today that all of us have to, in a small way, have to deal with. But what's interesting, Roger Williams, a big chunk of his book is making a distinction there. So he's saying in his work, there should not be a state religion. The state should not attempt to impose on the liberty of conscience of the individual. But then people would say, well, you're just, the terminology of the time would be to say you're just an antinomian. You don't believe in law. You're a lawless, just indulgent, you're an antinomian. And his response was, well, no, I do believe that there's value for law, that there's something that binds us. We have social obligations, something that the state should indeed enforce. But that's the second table, and it should leave the first table alone. And so that's core to Roger Williams' conception of freedom of religion. It really is kind of the father of what we think of, kind of a progenitor of the modern conception of freedom of religion, which was different from mere religious tolerance, which was the older thing that freedom of religion evolves out of. So the First Amendment owes a massive debt a century and a half earlier to this guy. But what's interesting is he's rooting all of that in a particular theology based on the first and second tablets of the 10 Commandments. I find that interesting, and we're still dealing with the echoes today.
Well, isn't that really relevant to the current arguments between Christian nationalists now? Because some of them now, I think Joel Webon maybe, argues that all of both tablets can be regulated by the state. So today, don't agree about whether both tablets can be regulated.
You have to think of all this as a process. Essentially, we spent the years of between, the Reformation and the modern era, 200-300 years, gradually working out the problem, the contradictions of Christendom. And so it's a process. So if you go back to the early American founding, you can find anti-obscenity statutes, though increasingly they're less and less enforced. And essentially, because they start to recognize not just the practical difficulty of enforcement, but also what counts as obscenity becomes an issue. And people would define as obscenity any criticism of the constituted religious authorities. So if you're in Virginia and it's Anglican, and you were a Baptist and you criticized godlessness of the Anglicans requiring you to pay parish taxes, even though you're not Anglican, well, that's obscenity. That's blasphemy. That's, And so again, blasphemy ends up essentially being cover for an imposition of a state religion in a lot of ways.
So what I hear you saying is it hasn't worked anywhere.
No, I can't think of an example that I'd be like, this is Christian nationalism or even Christendom, and hey, it worked out gangbusters.
Yeah.
It's always, at best, heavily asterisked, and its success is due to other factors, and that, or at worst, just an abject failure. I'll give you an example. If you're doing some John Winthrop stuff, this is something I wrote about a while back. There was an incident where you really see the ethical and moral bankruptcy of John Winthrop on clear display in a way that I think resonates today with Christian nationalist figures in Congress and their kind of utter ethical and moral bankruptcy when it comes to putting people who are sexual assaulters and drunks and just horrible people in high office because they're tempted by power and access more than they are by their principled defense of biblical virtues. So imagine that you are a young mother in the Massachusetts colony in the 17th century. You're 26. You've just given birth to a stillborn daughter who had anencephaly, so obvious physical deformities. Your name's Mary Dyer. You bury your child secretly because at the time, deformed children were seen as an obvious sign of God's displeasure. You did something wrong. Well, this ends up becoming a massive political issue because Mary Dyer was good friends with someone named Anne Hutchison, who was a part of a dissenting faction from the Massachusetts Bay Colony's Puritan authorities. Someone who, like Roger Williams, Anne Hutchison believes in individual soul liberty, believes in not having state-imposed religion. So Mary Dyer is part of the other political tribe. So they pressure your religious and political opponents. They're united. And this means John Winthrop. He's in charge. He's in politics at the time. They pressure one of your friends into telling them where your daughter was buried. They dig her up. They exhume her without your permission, write up a very detailed, gruesome description of her deformities on her decaying corpse, and then mail copies to every minister in your area, and then publish a book that uses your dead child as proof that you're under God's judgment, not in a general sense, but because of your religious and political beliefs, because you're part of this other faction. That's why God judged you and sent you this deformed child. And all of this was then used as a pretext to bring Anne Hutchison, your good friend, to trial and then to banish her from the colony. That's John Winthrop. That was the tentpole of his campaign, essentially, to become colony governor. And then the consequence of this is once he becomes governor, he promptly banishes Dyer, that mother, the poor mother of this child, banishes her to England, where she goes and becomes a Quaker. She returns 20 years later after Winthrop's gone. But his successor as governor hangs her because she refuses to recant or stop preaching. In fact, there's this really striking moment on the hanging on the platform where one of her own former pastors, who was kind of part of the Winthrop faction, called on her to repent and save her soul, maybe even her life. The governor gives her clemency. And she replied, "Nay, man, I am not now to repent." And then she was asked if, right before the hanging, did she want some of the church elders to pray for her soul? And she gave this just biting answer. And she said, "I know never an elder here. You're all fakes and frauds and phonies and grifters."
Yeah.
Like, no, I don't recognize any of your authority, religious or spiritual.
No elders in the house.
No elders in the house. So now that's simultaneously horrifying. But is it all that different from the way in which right now people will say, well, look, it's there are echoes of that when someone like Pat Robertson would say, well, it's the homosexuals who are responsible for God sending a hurricane. Or someone saying the wildfires in California are because of the unrighteousness of the people in Pasadena, and so on. We recognize that same impulse now. And so in a lot of ways, Christian nationalism, then that of John Winthrop, is not so different from the Christian nationalists who are, in charge of Congress and in charge of the executive branch or supportive of the executive branch and so on.
And here's the Christian nationalism in that the Congress, the Republicans want to make aid to California. They want strings attached to that aid because they're so wicked out there. Some Republican congresswoman said that very thing.
Yeah. Well, and you'll hear echoes of this too, where like something will happen even on a petty level. Things like, well, it's because the opposite tribe is a godless, Democrat, a democrat. Yeah. That's why their kids ended up overdosing on drugs or coming out as trans or go down the list of whatever. Again, it's linking something they find unfortunate to their lack of faith. We would call that superstition, the idea that physical deformities are a product of God's displeasure. That's something from the era of burn the witches because the cow got sick, right? Yet it persists today.
Sadly, it does persist to this day. What really stands out to me in the story of Mary Dyer is the cruelty of the Puritan leaders. Regular listeners will recall my conversation with Jamar Tisby about this same issue. The Puritans claimed to live out their faith in the public square while they perpetrated despicable deeds in God's name. Fast forward to today's Trump administration and the deportation of a child with brain cancer. Even though she is a citizen, her parents are not. Once routine, now seeking care for a life-threatening disease is apparently considered a threat to the Trump administration. I frequently come back to the golden rule when I think about these matters. If I don't want to be forced to engage in religious practices I don't believe in, then I should not require such things of others. I certainly want to live in peace and follow my conscience, and so I should allow my neighbor to do the same thing. Again, I want to thank Paul Matzko for his time and expertise today. Please follow the podcast and share it with your friends. Stay tuned for another great interview with Roger Finke on why separation of church and state is good for both church and state. The final episode of the season is coming up and will feature information about my upcoming book, The Christian Past That Wasn't. Music today was provided by Earl's Taco Shack, Jonathan Swaim, and Jonus Fair. Thanks for all the great reviews and ratings, and as always, thanks for listening.